Hello and welcome to this section on crime in the later Middle Ages. Now, a couple of points of clarification. Firstly, when we talk about the later Middle Ages, we are talking about the years from round about 1250 to round about 1500. So here's a wonderful timeline that I have prepared for you. However, be aware that we are going to sneak back in time to before 1250 because there's quite a lot of changes in this section and it helps to know how and why they developed. Secondly, when we talk about law enforcement, we're obviously talking about the process of stopping the crime and catching the criminal, but in this section we're also going to include the courts in that and deciding the criminal's guilt, and that's because those roles get increasingly intertwined in the later Middle Ages, so it makes sense to consider them together. Finally, this is quite a big section and it's quite detail heavy. So it made most sense to me to sort of squish it all together, try and get it out of the way and fill it full of pictures. You probably will need your concentrating caps on, however. So hold on to your hats, folks. Here we go. So when we look at law enforcement, I find it usually quite useful to consider England in different units. So you can consider it as one unit and a single country called England, which is run by one man and operates as one area. However, England is divided down into smaller areas. So first of all, it's divided down into what we call shires or counties. The Anglo-Saxons called them shires, the Normans called them counties, we call them counties still. So that's first of all. Those are then divided down into smaller areas called hundreds, which were originally apparently where 100 families lived. And then the hundreds are divided down into even smaller areas called tithings. In the later Middle Ages as well, the towns become increasingly important, and these present a problem for law enforcement because towns mean increased crime, and the law enforcement systems aren't set up to deal with towns, they're set up to deal with the countryside because England is rural. So as we see these towns grow, and for example in 1500 London contained about 50,000 people, York contained about 11,000, and obviously there are others too. As these towns grow, the systems that they have in place gradually become stretched. It's much harder in towns because there are more people and not everybody knows everybody else. So there isn't as much anonymity and it's easier to get away with crime with more opportunities. So things are going to have to change there. Now, in terms of actually catching the criminal, a lot of the responsibility still lies with the local community through something called hue and cry. So the idea that if you see a crime being committed, it is your responsibility to raise hue and cry by shouting for help and raising the alarm, and it's the responsibility of anyone who hears you to join the hue and cry and to chase the criminal down. In addition to that, the different areas have a system of reeves, officials to oversee crime, law and order in the area. So the Shire has a Shire reeve, usually a noble, and his name eventually gets shortened to sheriff. So we'll give him a star because that's who he is. The hundredsman would have, the hundred would have a hundredsman, usually maybe a wealthy farmer, making sure that the hundreds were following the law, and then each tithing would have someone called a tithing man, a responsible villager. And these were appointed every year, so there'd be quite a lot of changeover between them. Also, they didn't get paid for this role, so they would do it alongside whatever their day job was. And that's the situation. Oh, courts. Each area also has a court. So there's the Royal Court, run by the King for really important crimes involving really important people. Then there's a Shire Court, which would be overseen by a noble and run by a noble. Then there was a Hundreds Court, which would be overseen by the sheriff. And in the tithings, there would be something called manor court, which would be run by the local lord. So that's the situation by the 12th century. However, it is about to change. And that's because of this man. This is Henry II. When he takes over England in the year 1154, at the age of 21, Henry takes over a country that has spent the last 20 years fighting a civil war. And during the civil war, a number of very rich and important barons and nobles took advantage of the chaos to really treat their subjects in their areas very badly. And because they represented the law, there was nobody to stop them if they decided to steal other people's stuff or to hurt people or murder them. So Henry is really keen to bring law and order back under the control of the king. And in 1164, he passes something called the Size of Clarendon. And this involves the creation of royal judges. They're actually called the Justices of Eyre. And these are men that Henry trusts to carry out his decisions. And they are supposed to travel the country twice a year, hearing important cases involving serious crimes. Henry also, to help this along, sets up a system of prisons. Not so much really because as a punishment, but to keep hold of the criminals until the Justices of Eyre arrive. He also issues written instructions to all the sheriffs to make sure that they are all obeying the same rules and behaving in the same way. So we have that as well. So Henry is beginning to standardise the laws of England and to make sure that the same laws are being applied in different areas. This work is then continued by his son, even though he and his son didn't get on and actually fought wars with each other. But this is Richard I, aka Richard the Lionheart, and he is king from 1189 to 1199, and he also creates a number of new roles which are directly answerable to the king in crime and punishment. So the first of these is the coroner, who investigated suspicious deaths. So if somebody died and the cause wasn't immediately obvious, the coroner would go and measure the body. That's why he's got a tape measure, make a note of all the injuries and wounds and report back. Richard also creates what he calls keepers of the king's peace. And these were particularly for unruly areas. So areas where law and order is breaking down a bit, Henry would send knights who were loyal to him to be keepers of the king's peace. Round about this time as well, towns are divided into wards because there are too many people in them to keep tabs on. So they're divided into wards, which are a little bit like tithings, and that makes them easier to manage. Next up, about 170 years later, we have another strong king. And this one here is Edward I. He's king from 1272 to 1307. And he passes laws called the Statute of Winchester. And these make a number of changes. For starters, they create what is known as the County Assizes in 1293. And these involve those royal judges who are now expected to travel the country 2 to 3 times a year. And so 2 to 3 times a year, every few months, there would be a huge procession into everybody's area of these royal judges, accompanied by all their clerks and their advisors, coming to judge the serious crimes. So that's one change that Edward makes. The Statutes of Winchester of 1285 also allow the sheriff the ability to raise a posse. So where's our sheriff gone? There he is. So the sheriff can raise a posse to chase criminals if he needs to. That means he can get local men to help him chase people down, and they were expected to stay armed so that they were ready to hunt down criminals if it came to it. He also changes the role of the hundredsman from one person to two people, two chief constables of the 100 is what that job becomes. And the tithing man becomes known as the parish constable. A parish is like the smallest unit of local government. So those roles change slightly. Edward also creates something called the night watchman for towns. So here we go. This was a really, really unpopular job. Basically, night watchmen were supposed to roam the streets of their town at night, watch the walls, keep an eye out for suspicious characters, raise hue and cry, and then report back to the parish constables in the morning. Nobody particularly liked doing it, from what we can gather. So those are the changes that are introduced by Edward. Finally, there are a few changes that are introduced by his grandson, who is over here, whose name is Edward III. And he is king from 1327, of course, to 1377, so quite a long reign. Now, when he first takes power in 1327, he continues with this idea of, here we go, where are they? Keepers of the king's peace, because he judges that they should be in every area, and he states that they should be people who are considered to be good and lawful men. And by the year 1361, keep on getting the wrong century, so that's 1327, this is 1361, these are known as justices of the peace, and they are basically from the local area, people who act as magistrates in the courts. And they're known as JPs for short. This is a really successful system that actually continues right up until the 1970s. So we now have JPs. In 1388, they are supposed to meet up for 4 sessions a year, which are known as the quarterly sessions. And in 1389, they are granted 4 shillings a day as pay for doing this, although that doesn't last very long because generally they're quite wealthy. They're from the local area, but they're not ordinary people. They would have been quite rich. So that's one change. Another change that Edward brings in is that the parish constable is given the responsibility of making everybody in the tithing practice their archery on a Sunday. And that was to make sure that they were ready in case they had to fight or chase anyone. So all of that is crime and punishment. If we look at this very quickly, some of the patterns that we can see, first of all, we see an increase in the power of the kings. It's not a coincidence that all of the kings we've looked at are quite powerful and quite popular kings, and they introduced these laws to really spread their influence through the country. Another thing that they're bringing in is increased consistency and accountability to the different roles. So people are more likely to follow the rules in the same way. What we do see though is we see a reduction in the power of the local communities. They aren't making the decisions anymore, although they are still enforcing the law. The decisions are more and more coming from the king. And we've reached the end of this section. Well done everybody. I will see you in the next one.